If anyone has an idea for a new show and you ask, what are the sort of gold standards for a discussion show or talk show, Firing Line will always be up there. Buckley knew that ideas couldn't be cloistered in institutions alone. The whole point of ideas was to get them out there and to contest them and in front of as wide a public as possible. One of the interesting things about Firing Line is it showed Buckley's desire to approach the public through every available medium. Obviously, he had National Review as his main outlet, but he also wrote for the popular press. He then, of course, really made his name, became famous to a lot of Americans through Firing Line. And it's interesting because it was innovative in lots of ways. And I'd say, interestingly, it's had sort of two lives now. It had the life it had when it first aired, and you still, meet people all the time who say, I always used to watch Bill Buckley on Firing Line, and they remember particular episodes for either confrontational reasons or for just interesting ideas and important ideas that were got out. But now it has a second life as well, because of course Firing Line is now on YouTube. And so a whole new generation of people are discovering it, and that's a wonderful thing. I think Buckley would have adored that.
Yes, and I understand that Buckley favored formality over this more casual type of style that is now common in a lot of podcasts that are consumed by Gen Z. He actually did want there to be a level of sophistication in the way he conducted Firing Line. And I think that poses an interesting challenge because I know that Gen Z really likes conversational tone. That's why YouTube is such a popular platform for young people, and they trust personalities over institutions these days. So Buckley was phenomenal in that he did bring a level of seriousness and like this kind of refined nature to civil discourse, but he was also a very approachable personality. The way that he treated his interviewees was very much like a curious professor,
yes.
Like a very composed interlocutor. He always kept his decorum, even if things got heated at times, and I think that's a rare quality in today's media settings.
He had obviously a desire to bring the best out from his guests, whether he agreed with them or not. He wanted them to perform, to speak as well as they could, and if they were expounding a set of ideas, to do it as well as possible. One of the interesting things about Firing Line is that Buckley, you can see, is incredibly well prepared, and usually has his clipboard, and the opening introductions themselves to each guest, the masterpieces of prose. He was always prepared for the interview, and of course he realized that, and it's a bit in distinction to some podcasters and others today, he realized you had to be very, very prepared in order to make it look like it hadn't been.
Yes, there's one episode that strikes me, and I feel that maybe Gen Z may enjoy this example. It's his interview with Hugh Hefner.
Oh, yes.
And the way that he calmly challenged his presuppositions about the moral order that he was trying to argue should be overthrown. Speaking of clips, they've been trending all over social media lately, at least I've seen online. And I think what was amazing about that interview is that, again, it's the Socratic method. What struck me is how he asked Hugh Hefner, what gives you the authority to throw off all of the moral code of antiquity, of previous ancestors who definitely know better, to thousands of years of history of a certain sexual framework and code that's worked for humankind. What makes you so sure that you've cracked it, and then now you can be rid of this and impose a type of hedonism? He didn't come at that conversation from an antagonistic point of view. He had a very charitable assumption of Hugh Hefner, which is, okay, you're exploring this idea and you think you've hit it something remarkable, but in reality, what makes you God? What makes you such a genius that you can overthrow the moral order that has worked for millennia?
There's another thing that's interesting about that episode, which, and it's a case on a lot of the episodes of Firing Line, is that, of course, there are guests who you're rather surprised that Buckley has got, but then you're rather surprised that some of the guests have agreed to it. And of course, the reason is that they know that he wasn't there to do a gotcha. He was genuinely there to tease out what was underneath this churn of ideas and culture that was going on. He wanted Hefner to explain what the hell he thought he was doing.
Yes.
And Hefner has a crack at it. And it's up to the viewer to decide whether or not that crack at it is satisfactory or not.
Right. It was a genuine pursuit of truth that he was after. And in that case, I think by the conclusion of the episode, many are led to wonder whether Hugh Hefner really has a command of the philosophy of what Playboy is meant to be. And, Buckley effectively forced Hefner to concede that it has unleashed all these negative consequences throughout society, and we're seeing the ramifications still today with gender ideology.
One of the many interesting things about Firing Line, you can tell it in Buckley's prose as well on the page, but in person in Firing Line, he displays something incredibly important, which I think is, most people would agree is slightly lacking today, on whatever political side they're on. It's what Wilde once described as the ability to play gracefully with ideas. And Firing Line is an extraordinary, absolute pinnacle on any public network, and a masterclass of how adults can play gracefully with ideas. And the grace, it doesn't end up in a sort of 3-minute shouting match. It is actually going in with good intent. It is hearing something you disagree with and thinking, well, that's very interesting. I disagree with that, but here are the reasons why. Not just, you've offended me.
Right.
Something like that, which is now the way to shut something down if you don't like it. But just, well, yes, I might find that offensive, what you've proposed, but here's what I would suggest instead. And it really is a masterclass of that. It really is just an extraordinary thing, watching him, not just talking, but watching him listening. Yeah. And that is something very, very rare.
And that's a skill, to be a good listener. And like you said, it's increasingly sparse in our society. And you made a great point, which is if there was evasiveness on the part of the interviewee, Buckley would just keep repeating the question he had asked until they addressed it. And I think today I lament the keyboard warriors all over online. It's so easy when you're not connected by, like we're having right now, a roundtable discussion, but just virtually through screens. It's so easy to hurl ad hominems at your intellectual opponent, but by being side by side, face to face, in a very genteel setting, I think Buckley not only brought civility to public discourse, but there was just so much respect for just having intellectual discourse. There was so much respect for others with ideas.
It's something to do with the face-to-face interaction, isn't it? I mean, as you say, like, if people are online, it's that famous thing, people are incredibly brave when they're at the keyboard. If you're online, or if you're not even face-to-face in an interaction with another person, it's much easier to dehumanize, misrepresent, lie, shout, and much more. In person, it is, or should be, sort of hard. If you said something now that I deeply disagreed with, I'd like to think because we're face-to-face, even if you were rude to me, that I would find a way to be polite. If we were not face-to-face, there's that endless temptation to show the worst side of yourself, the worst side of discourse. And some of the ones where Buckley was clearly in deep disagreement and a certain amount of contempt, perhaps, well hidden, but slight contempt for the ideas of the other person. I'm thinking of an interview like the interview with Noam Chomsky. He keeps it incredibly light. I see that episode, it's rather like watching a master fencer. He has his sword out, and he's waving it around slightly, but really when he goes into a jab, it's almost as if the other person doesn't quite notice what's just happened to them.
Well, right. I think it requires just being on Buckley's level in order to see those jabs coming. And I mean, they were good matches at times, but I think very few could actually come close to his genius. But I think what also introduced levity into the conversations was Buckley's witticisms. That I also think is rare today because everybody takes everything so seriously. And I think wit is also a dying art altogether. I'm reminded of Buckley's debate with Ronald Reagan over the Panama Canal, and right off the bat, Reagan, I mean, they were allies, of course, politically, but this was a debate. They were on opposite sides of this, and Reagan says something to the effect of, I know you're just honored to be in my presence, and Buckley responds with, something like, I fear if I drew any closer to you, you would be blinded by my brilliance, something like that. And it's just one example of Buckley wanted to keep things light, as you say, even if there were very serious political discussions at hand.
Buckley knew that sometimes to drive home an incredibly serious point, you had to use humor. To quote Eliot, humankind cannot bear very much reality. He knew that, and he knew that one of the ways to encourage people, allow people to bear some of the reality of things that were going on, including things in their name, was to undercut it with a dash of wit. One of my favorite examples is in the Chomsky discussion. They're clearly great loggerheads over everything to do with America and the world. Chomsky sees every part of American influence in the world as entirely negative, and Buckley disagrees. Buckley starts to notice that there's not an anti-American group that doesn't seem to gain the imprint, the approval of Chomsky. And at some point Buckley mentions the Khmer Rouge, and he says, and they hate America, Mr. Chomsky, so you must love them. And it's such a deft way of doing it, because if he'd have simply said, I bet you support the Khmer Rouge, that doesn't land. It lands because it's got a slice of wit.
And I think it requires, like I said, a certain intellect to blend comedy into intellectual discussions. I think it takes a certain brain. And yeah, to your point, I think in comedy, there's always a nugget of truth. And so, and it is effective because it calls out the absurd. It tends to call out the absurd, and it hits the truth so clearly without having to litigate it in detail. It's just a joke.
The great late Clive James, Australian polymath, had that wonderful line about humor where he said, humor and common sense are the same thing moving at different speeds.
Yeah.
Humor is simply common sense dancing. And I love that insight, and it's absolutely true, because if people laugh at something, they laugh at it often in spite of themselves, and even if they're not meant to.
And there's something involuntary sometimes about a well-crafted joke, and so you can disarm an intellectual opponent with a great crack.
He managed that. There was a great debate that Buckley did in the 80s, where a debate on Soviet communism, and everybody on the other side is equating both sides in the Cold War as being effectively moral as well as strategic equals. And Buckley is having none of it, and he has that great moment where he says the other side, he said, are trying to persuade you that somebody who pushes an elderly lady in front of an oncoming bus and somebody who pushes an elderly lady away from the path of an oncoming bus are both people who go around pushing about old ladies. And it's such a great line, and even his opponents laugh at it. Because if he just simply talked again about the moral difference of democracy against the totalitarianism, or the USA against the USSR, that wouldn't have done it. But he gets even his opponents laughing at the absurdity of what they themselves are engaging in.
And that's why comedy is so dangerous to, I would say, progressive ideology, is because it is so effective at undercutting their arguments, and Buckley was a master at that, and so he was very dangerous, I suppose, rhetorically in that way.
Yes. There's a very interesting thing that Buckley was ahead of the curve on, which is that a lot of bad ideas were being smuggled into the culture in excruciatingly bad prose. That bad ideas had to disguise themselves by being almost impossible to understand. He noticed the academic ease of people who are now very widely, pretended to have been read, if not actually read. And he realized that there was something dishonest going on in this. And there's a very important thing in that, which is that Buckley knew, and you see it throughout the Firing Line episodes and elsewhere, he knew that it was very easy to make a bad or a simple idea sound complex. All you need to add is things like meta in front of a word that doesn't need it, or add endless syllables after the end of the word, lengthen the word, make the sentence excruciatingly long, and you'd get a headache if you had to read it twice. And he knew that's very easy. Any dolt can do that. But that actually it requires incredible skill and learning to make a difficult idea sound easy. And if you're dealing with public broadcasting, if you're speaking to the widest possible audience, yes, you could make them all feel complete strangers in the language and in the culture and much more. But he knew that there wasn't any point in that. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to communicate things that were true in the simplest possible way. And it's like boiling something down to its essence and really showing people what that is. And many people are very scared of doing that, either because they think they can't do it or because they don't want to do it. They want their obscure and unpleasant ideas to either remain obscure or to become as popular as possible with people who don't understand them.
I would say, Douglas, I've noticed two contemporary phenomena, though, with language, which one is the glorification and glamorization of very bad ideas with actually quite flowery language.
Yeah.
Euphemisms, for example,
Yes.
are very commonplace in our politics, and I often wonder what Buckley would say to the left's use of euphemistic language to justify their proposals. I mean, one that was dear to his heart, that the life issue, reproductive rights is one example. He had a command of the English language, obviously, and I think there's some very sorry excuses of people in the press who claim to be journalists or they claim to have a strong grip on language. They abuse it to advance, particular goals. And I wonder what Buckley would say to all of that.
I think he'd have had a field day with it. One of the exciting things about Firing Line as it was going out was the fact that clearly viewers could get almost anybody in front of them sitting in a studio with Bill Buckley. He ranged very, very widely across the culture. It wasn't just politics and the arts, sport, popular entertainment, and much more. We've got Muhammad Ali hovering over our shoulders. And that's a very good example. It's an extraordinary discussion, the one with Muhammad Ali. And even more extraordinary when you remember that the person tuning in didn't necessarily know that week whether they were going to get, a professor from Harvard or Muhammad Ali. And Buckley had this sort of ecumenicalism about him, that he realized that all of these people were important. They all had something to say. And that they would be able to, if they could hold their own with him, he was delighted to play around with ideas with them, and it must have been a thrilling thing at the time. I know it's still thrilling in the second life of Firing Line on YouTube, just to think, I can't believe he also spoke to him or to her. It's an amazing gift, that.
If you wanted to be a well-rounded individual, Firing Line strikes me as that one-stop shop for how to expand your horizons intellectually, culturally. I mean, he was a Renaissance man in private life, and it's so clear that the life of the mind is what motivated Buckley. And I think like you said, there was such a diverse cast of characters that came on that show, and it's because there were so many discussions to have, not just in politics, but in arts, in athletics, and kind of a very important stimulating space for people to grow as humans.
I'm trying to think if there's anything today that is similar.
I'd say Joe Rogan, it may be comparable because he does bring on, one might say, random people from different corners that you wouldn't expect. And I'd say he's like the modern version of Buckley, that he likes to sit back and listen while the person explains their field or their discipline, and then he interjects with sometimes provocative questions, but sometimes they're just honest questions, like help me understand this concept.
Yes.
But I think Buckley was distinctly different because he had such a wealth of knowledge about so many subjects, so he was able to challenge, even if it wasn't his specialty that the interviewee was coming with, he knew something about it because he was so well read.
And he also had an ideology he could defend, and he wished to defend and would if needed.
Right.
In the interview, if the interviewee was wildly away from what Buckley himself believed, Buckley would explain where he was coming from and why, and he wasn't afraid to do that. So it wasn't as if the interviewer was entirely impartial. He wasn't. He was there also on behalf off of a set of ideas and a set of cultural ideas, which were, of course, of fundamental importance to him. It was not obvious at the time that Buckley started Firing Line, it was not obvious that a figure like him would either need to reach out to a wider public, or would wish to reach out to a wider public, or would enjoy reaching out to a wider public. But that's what you can see in Firing Line, is that Buckley knew that ideas couldn't be cloistered in institutions alone. The whole point of ideas was to get them out there and to contest them in public and in front of as wide a public as possible. It wasn't obvious that somebody of his background would do that. Television was relatively early startup still at the time. It was a work in progress. There were rules of television we now hold that nobody knew then. And so he sort of helped create, really, much of the culture of public debate, discussion, that people are at their best still grasping for now. It's an extraordinary thing to me that if anyone has an idea for a new show and you ask, what are the sort of gold standards for a discussion show or talk show, Firing Line will always be up there with anyone of any knowledge. They always point to it as the gold standard. And he made it. It was a path that he managed to walk himself and that others have walked in his footsteps.
And clearly it was such an enjoyable forum that his guests were often repeat guests.
Yes.
They couldn't wait to come back because it was very constructive. It was, like I said, very stimulating. And I think as for the live audience, it's one thing to listen to an episode over the airwaves, but I think it's another thing altogether to be witness to very lively, energetic civil discourse in person. To be an active participant is very exciting, and I think that is, to your point, it does contribute to the culture of free discourse in the country.
Yes, there were a set of people who, like Galbraith and others, who came back repeatedly because Buckley realized there were people who needed to be repeatedly heard from. If anyone wants to know how to have civil but interesting and sparky discussion, they should watch Firing Line. It really is a masterclass of that. And there's lots of reasons for that. But Buckley did really cover so many different realms of life, so many different interests. His guests were encouraged to shine. Some guests, like Milton Friedman and others, were very, it's not obvious, again, that an economist could or should be on sort of primetime television for an hour. But Buckley encouraged that. He got guests on who he was stimulated by and who he knew would stimulate the audience, and then was able to bring out the best in them. And I know a lot of people today think that the state of public discourse isn't great, and I don't know, you may agree or disagree with that. If it isn't great, then we should look to the things that are and have been and learn from them.